Good morning, champions, and happy Wednesday. Today's going to be a great day. We're going to learn about how multiplying by different sizes of numbers affects the size of the product. You're going to do a great job. I know it, and so does Mr. Smiles. Let's dive right in. We're going to start today with a division problem. 375 divided by 4. First, when I'm dividing, I need to decide where to start my division. Can I split 3 hundreds into 4 groups? 37 tens into 4 groups, or 375 ones into 4 groups? I'm going to start with 37 tens. So I need to figure out how many times does 4 go into 37. 4 goes into 37 9 times. Now I'm going to multiply. What's 9 times 4? 9 times 4 is 36. Now I can subtract to find how many tens are left over. 7 minus 6 is 1, and I can bring down my 5. Now I need to split 15 ones into 4 groups. How many times does 4 go into 15? 4 goes into 15 3 times. 4 times 3 is 12. When I subtract, how much do I have left over? I have 3 left over. My answer is 93, remainder 3. Let's do another example. 2 tenths times 4 tenths. First, I need to see how many numbers are going to be behind the decimal in my answer. Well, tenths times tenths is hundredths, so there will be 2 digits behind my decimal. So how am I going to place the decimal in my answer? Well, 2 times 4 is 8, and I need 2 numbers behind the decimal, so the answer is 8 hundredths. Let's find 2/3 of 21. First, I need to multiply 2/3 times 21. When I multiply 2/3 times 21, what improper fraction results? Well, 2 times 21 is 42 over 3. What should I do now? I need to divide to change this into a whole number. When I divide 42 divided by 3, should I start with 4 tens or 42 ones? I should start with 4 tens. How many times does 3 go into 4? 3 goes into 4 one time. 1 times 3 is 3. How many tens do I have left over? I have 1 10 left over, and I can bring down my 2. Now I need to divide 12 ones by 3. How many times does 3 go into 12? 3 goes into 12 4 times. 4 times 3 is 12. When I subtract, I have none left over. The answer is 14. 14 is 2/3 of 21. Now let's do a fraction addition problem. Can I add 1/5 plus 1/2 like they are? No, I can't, because when I add fractions, they have to have the same denominator. So I'm going to draw a T-chart. 1/5 and 1/2. First, I need to find the least common denominator. What's the least common denominator of 1/5 and 1/2? Well, when I list my multiples, the smallest number on both lists is 10. So my least common denominator is 10. Now I need to change both fractions so that they have a denominator of 10. When I change 1/5 so that the denominator is 10, what is my new numerator? It's 2. When I change 1/2 so that the denominator is 10, what is the new numerator? It's 5. So now I can add 2 tenths plus 5 tenths. What's 2 tenths plus 5 tenths? It's 7 tenths. Today we're going to talk about what happens when you multiply by different kinds of fractions. We're going to start by multiplying 1 times several different numbers to see if our result is bigger or smaller. Let's start with 1 times 1/2. What's 1 times 1/2? 1 times 1/2 is 1/2. Is 1/2 bigger than 1, smaller than 1, or equal to 1? 1/2 is less than 1 whole. So when I multiply times 1/2, my answer gets smaller, it becomes less. Let's look at another example. What's 1 times 2/3? It's 2/3. Is that bigger than 1, smaller than 1, or equal to 1? Well, 2/3 is less than 1. So when I multiply times 2/3, my answer becomes less. Let's look at another example. What's 1 times 4/5? It's 4/5. Is that bigger than 1, smaller than 1, or equal to 1? It's less than 1 because it doesn't have all its pieces. 5/5 would be equal to 1. So anytime you multiply by a proper fraction, the product is less than the original factor. Every time you multiply by a fraction, your answer gets smaller. What happens when I multiply by a fraction equal to 1? Well, what's 1 times 4/4? It's 4/4. I know that if I divide 4 divided by 4, it's equal to 1. What's 1 times 2/2? It's 2/2. And if I divide 2/2, I get 1. It's equal to 1. And what's 1 times 3/3? Well, it's 3/3. And I know that that's the same as 1 whole. Anytime you multiply by a fraction equal to 1, a fraction with the same numerator and denominator, the product is equal to the original factor. What if I multiply it times an improper fraction or a mixed number? What's 1 times 5/4? It's 5/4. That's an improper fraction, a numerator greater than its denominator. So is that more than 1 or less than 1? That's greater than 1. What about 1 times 2 and 1/2? Well, is 2 and 1/2 greater than 1 or less than 1? It's greater than 1. When I multiply by a number that's greater than 1, my answer becomes larger. So when I multiply times a fraction, my answer gets smaller. When I multiply times a fraction equal to 1, my answer stays the same. And when I multiply times a mixed number or improper fraction, it gets larger. Let's look at an example. If I multiply 4 and 1/2 times 2/3, is that going to be greater than 4 and 1/2 or less than 4 and 1/2? First, am I multiplying by a proper fraction, a fraction equal to 1, or a fraction greater than 1? I'm multiplying by a proper fraction, a fraction less than 1. So what happens to my product? It's going to be less than 4 and 1/2. What about 4 and 1/2 times 2/3? Am I multiplying by a number less than 1, equal to 1, or greater than 1? This time, I'm multiplying by a number greater than 1. So my answer is going to be more than 2/3. Let's try this one. Am I multiplying 3 and 1/4 by a number less than 1, equal to 1, or greater than 1? I'm multiplying by a number equal to 1. So it's going to be equal. Am I multiplying 3/3 by a number less than 1, greater than 1, or equal to 1? I'm multiplying by a number greater than 1. So it's going to be greater. In this example, am I multiplying 2/5 by a number less than 1, equal to 1, or greater than 1? I'm multiplying by a number equal to 1. It's going to be equal. Am I multiplying 4/4 times a number less than 1, equal to 1, or greater than 1? I'm multiplying by a number less than 1. So my answer will be less. Look at this question. Which would result in a product less than 5/6? Which one is multiplied by a proper fraction? The correct answer here is B. A would be greater, C would be equal, and D would be greater. which would result in a product greater than 516? The answer here would be C. A would be less, B would be equal, C would be greater because 5 halves is greater than 1. You've done a great job on this video. Go ahead and take your exit ticket and then return to Prodigy Practice.